wherever you go.
1460 WVOX.
Stay tuned now for Westchester Eye on the Radio with Peter Moses, John Sharan, and Ardina Seward on 1460 WVOX.
Welcome, everybody, to Westchester Eye on the Radio. I'm Peter Moses with my co-host, John Sharan, and the improved Ardina Seward, who was out sick last week, and I guess she proved that her health has returned by not only plunging into the cold Long Island Sound, but did so at Orchard Beach.
Yep.
Which, in the best of times, is a difficult place to go swimming.
29-degree water, but my daughter and I, it's our second year doing it, and it's for a good cause. It's to raise awareness of the plight of homeless people in the Bronx. We did it for under 5 minutes, and we were cold. But you think about the people who are out there for the winter, who don't have the option of getting in their car, turning the heat on, going home to a heated house.
Actually, in the Bronx right now, you could live in public, or anywhere in New York City, you can live in public housing and still have no access to heater hot water.
And you could be in jail, too.
Yeah, in Brooklyn.
Yeah.
Brooklyn to be in jail as well. Sorry to interrupt you. I just had to throw that in because it's disgusting what's going on in and around New York City these days and around the country. And it's a very difficult time to be a
compassionate person.
And a poor, and an American who doesn't have access to a lot of money.
Mm-hmm.
And today we have with us, we have three guests. We have a professor from Fordham University, the fine university that I think only exists so people can go to Arthur Avenue in the Belmont section.
There are worse locations if you're hungry.
There are.
There are many benefits to Fordham University. That's only one of the hundreds of advantages of that university.
You can walk to the zoo. You can walk to the botanical garden.
You can also get an excellent education.
You can also get an excellent education at Fordham University.
Yes.
We have with us now. I think that was founded by Irish priests, and we have with us a lovely Irish woman today who edited a book called Sacred Shelter. She's
He's being sarcastic.
A Fordham professor. She's Susan Celia Greenfield, I think it is.
Yeah, there you go.
And she's of course a Catholic nun. Wait a minute, you're not wearing the hat.
No habit.
Yeah, sorry. But I am wearing black. But anyway, just in case you really look me up, it's not Greenfield. It's just plain Greenfield.
And the book's full title is
Sacred Shelter, 13 Journeys of Homelessness and Healing. And I edited the book, and it features the life stories of 13 people who experienced homelessness and are now no longer homeless, and are really models of resilience and courage, but also of service.
Before we get into their stories, because we're going to have to go to break in 3 minutes, and we'll be off for news breaks for 7 or 8 minutes. Why don't we get into some numbers if you have access to them? What is the number of? You don't have the numbers.
I mean,
of
this book is not about policy so much, but you can try me. I might know some answers.
What is the percentage of homeless New Yorkers out there, as far as you know, or sheer numbers?
I know that there are over 63,000 people in the shelters, in the shelter system in New York City, and that does not count the thousands of people who are on the streets or the many, many, many people who live with housing insecurity.
That's staggering.
It's a staggering number.
And many of them are children.
And these numbers are new. There's been a homelessness problem in New York City probably since New York City was founded. I mean,
right, but it began what's called the era of modern homelessness began in the 1970s, and it was then described as a crisis. But a crisis should end, and this has continued and gotten worse. I believe that now the number of people in the shelters are 75% higher than they were 10 years ago. And
John
certainly worse since the Great. This is the worst since the Great Depression.
John talked about compassion. That one of the things that's missing these days is compassion, and our the people who are here with you, the people who are part of this book, we'll talk about that part, their elements of it later. But there's a mayor in office who seems to be inured to the problems of homeless, or at least sounds tone deaf when he speaks about them.
There are policies in place that are beginning to set aside in certain very limited contexts housing for people who are homeless and affordable housing. But the gravity of the problem is such that without real attention and dedication, it cannot be solved with just a Band-Aid.
And that, for attention, has to do with the media and with a dwindling number of news sources, including the fact that New York Times still doesn't cover New York City very well. And the Post and Daily News has like 20 or 40 reporters, when a few years ago they had 250, is a problem. And getting the word out is a very difficult thing. So this book, Sacred Shelter, 13 Journeys of Homelessness and Healing, hopefully will let people know the extent of this problem, even though it's not that sort of book. It talks about people. Anyway, this is Westchester Eye on the Radio on WVOX and WVOX.com. We're about to have a Fox News and Fox Business break, and we'll see you on the other side of this news cycle.
Let's return now to Westchester Eye on the Radio with Peter Moses, John Sharan, and Ardina Seward on 1460 WVOX.
Welcome back, everybody. We are about to approach our second half hour of Westchester Eye on the Radio, which is also streamed live on WVOX.com. I am Ardina Seward along with Peter Moses, John Sharan, and our guests today are Susan Greenfield, who has written a book called Sacred Shelter, and along with Susan are two people who have given their narratives to the book, Dennis Barton and Sophie Worrell, who were formerly homeless and who managed to rise above it and who are now just shiny examples of how you can pull yourself up, get yourself out, and just keep going. Dennis, we were talking during the break about different kinds of shelters, different kinds of shelters, who goes into those shelters, and what life is like in those shelters. So let's start with you and your experience. I know that you had gone through a lot of traumatic events prior to your becoming homeless, and from Susan's book, I began to understand that homelessness doesn't just start when you're an adult. There's a pattern that starts early in childhood that just seems to morph and morph and morph until there's this catastrophic event, and then bang, you're out there in the street. So I've talked enough. I will yield to you.
Well, there can be some traumatic events in your life that may lead you to it. In my case, what led me to homelessness was addiction, and I was an addict for years. I didn't have to be on the street, but I chose to be on the street because of my addiction. I became homeless somewhere around 1984. I was later in life, you might call it a midlife crisis. I was somewhere around 40, 50 or something like that, and I was in my 30s actually. And because of addiction, I found myself on the street. This was the height of the crack epidemic. For years, I was homeless for almost 14 years.
And you were homeless in which boroughs? In
the Bronx, mainly in the Bronx. Okay. But, because New York has subways, you can be homeless anywhere. So I resisted shelters. I was homeless for almost 14 years. I resisted shelters. Shelters weren't the place you wanted to be. You had curfews. It didn't allow you to move freely. And shelters were also dangerous at times.
And probably still are.
So for 14 years, I was living on the streets in alleyways, rooftops. I've slept on the subway many a night, Staten Island Ferry, all those places. It wasn't until 1999 when I got arrested And this was my second felony arrest. You know, that I really made an effort to change. And I went upstate, did my time, and was paroled to a shelter. First time I had ever set foot in a shelter. I was paroled to
After how many years in prison?
I did a 1 to 3.
Okay.
All right, and I was paroled after a year. I went to Beverly Atlantic Men's Shelter. The night I got there very late at night, and it was, to me, in some ways, worse than jail.
And that was in Brooklyn?
That was in Brooklyn.
Okay.
Why?
It was worse because there was no structure there. There were people roaming the halls looking to victimize others. And so the next morning I made a decision. No, I'm not staying here. I went to Bellevue Men's Shelter. At Bellevue Men's Shelter, I would enroll in a substance abuse program across the street in Bellevue Hospital, and I would be there for 2 years. The director of that shelter was a great help in my recovery. And for 2 years, I was at Bellevue Men's Shelter going to a day program every day. And then somewhere around 2001, actually somewhere around 2001, I was offered an apartment in an SRO on the Upper West Side. But that came with a lot of hard work, and it came with a lot of help from good people like, you know, at the program. And I went to an educational outreach program at Catholic Charities, and they helped me with some tools to put my life back together. I'm no longer homeless. I don't sleep on trains anymore.
And your story is in this book.
My story is in that book.
How did you find out about what was the impetus for you to write your chapter?
Well, as I said, I went to an educational outreach program, a life skills empowerment program at Catholic Charities. A few years later, I was actually asked to facilitate one of those programs where I met Professor Greenfield. Professor Greenfield came in as a mentor at our program. But then she came to me and asked me, she said, Dennis, can I work with people to help them write their stories? Because that was one of the components of the educational outreach program. My particular program is called Panim al Panim, face to face in Hebrew. And it was actually housed at Susan's synagogue.
Which is where?
Well, it was initially housed at Anshe Hesed, which is at 100th Street and West End Avenue.
I know it.
But then it was actually moved to a different location.
Yeah. Well, anyway, Susan, Professor Greenfield, she was interested in helping us write our stories and helping our participants to write their stories.
Was it cathartic to write it down?
Most definitely cathartic.
Did you learn? I'm not trying to lead. I'm not trying to make leading answers.
Let me say this: that I wrote my story the first time when I was at EOP. Years later, in writing your story and telling your story, you come to grips with who you are.
And that's what happened with you.
That's what happened with me. I was able to come to grips with who I am. But it's also freeing in that you tell your truth. So Professor Greenfield had the idea for a book a few years back, and she asked me to be on her advisory board, and here we are today.
And we're going to have to pick that up on the other side of the break. You are listening to Westchester Eye on the radio. Our program is about Sacred Shelter, a book written by Susan Greenfield. Edited by Susan Greenfield. And there'll be more coming up. We're going to hear from Sophie Worrell, who's going to tell her story about having been homeless and having conquered the demons of homelessness. So stick with us. You can call in also, which our phone number is 914-636-0110 if you want to comment or you have a question. So stick with us, folks. We have more coming. Inspiration. You're listening to Westchester Eye on the radio. Hang in there.
1460 WVOX.
Let's return now to Westchester Eye on the Radio with Peter Moses, John Sharan, and Ardina Seward on 1460 WVOX.
Welcome back to Westchester Eye on the Radio, our weekly discussion of issues relating to Westchester and the surrounding area. I'm John Sharan, along with Peter Moses and Ardina Seward, and we have a full studio today with Professor of English at Fordham University, Susan Greenfield, the editor of Sacred Shelter, a book about the homeless problem in New York City, and two people who have worked hard to overcome homelessness, Dennis Barton and Sophie Worrell. And Professor Greenfield, perhaps you can tell us a little bit about what led you to write the book in the first place.
So there's a program called the Life Skills Empowerment Program, and under that umbrella program there are several different versions of the program. One is the Education Outreach Program, one is called Panim El Panim. It was founded 30 years ago by Catholic Charities and the Interfaith Assembly on Homelessness and Housing. And that program, in that program, participants who were homeless or are homeless are educated and come together to form a community to be empowered. And one of the things that happens in that program is everyone is asked to write a version of their life stories. And it brings in the whole community, which gets involved through congregations and various other ways. And I began as a mentor in that program. I met Dennis, who was actually running the program for other homeless people and formerly homeless people. And I found out that telling your life story was part of the program, and I thought the life stories that people were telling were absolutely riveting. And as a literature professor, I was, transfixed by the power, the beauty, the poetry, and the pain of these stories. And so I worked in that area of the organization for many years, and then it was actually George Horton of Catholic Charities who said, I've always hoped there would be a book that collected some of the life stories from these programs. And I had the resources and the wherewithal and the desire to get involved.
An interesting aspect of the book that I found was the reference to the fact that faith plays an important role in helping people to move forward, that having some sort of belief in others, belief in religion, belief in a higher calling, these things are all influential. And perhaps Sophia, perhaps Dennis, you two can talk to us a little, because you were two people who've been able to overcome your homelessness.
Okay, so for me, being homeless, I wasn't on the streets like Dennis. I came to this country actually in 2006 and found myself in a domestic violence relationship. And I was with my son. He was 19 at that time, and when I was going through it alone, I could suffer through it. But when I brought my son and he was seeing me being abused, I couldn't take it anymore. And it was like a luck of fate that caused me to find out about the shelter system. And I went into a domestic violence shelter at first. And unlike the experience that Dennis talked about, the domestic violence shelters are a lot more wonderful. And there you were really sheltered and taken care of. But the thing with a DV shelter, you only stay there for 3 months. And if you're a good resident, you get an extension for 6 months. And I was 6 months in shelter with my son. And we were just about to be transferred to a tier 2. But my son, he didn't want to be in the shelter anymore. This was something new to him, and he didn't want to, and he wanted to go back home. And because of that...
Where was home?
Home is Barbados.
Okay.
And I had to let him go back home because he wanted to. And then I experienced just what Dennis talked about. I was transferred to a single women's shelter. And the word terrible does not describe the shelter. It was a culture shock for me. It was ridiculous. I mean, I thought I would just go crazy in there. And it was like a prison. The police was there almost every day. And I saw things that I would never want to see again. And one of the worst things that really kind of sent me off the edge was to be in bed one day and to hear a relationship going on right beside my bed. It was just unbelievable. So this is something that I never experienced being from the Caribbean. And but I was rescued in a way because they had church groups that would come to the shelter. And through those church groups, I learned about life experience and faith sharing. And through life experience and faith sharing, then, like Dennis, I went on to the educational outreach program through Catholic Charities. And in that program, I was also given life skills to turn my life around. So the shelter is something that I wouldn't wish on anyone. But anyhow, I went to the life skill program, and through that, then I went to the Speakers Bureau through Interfaith Assembly, and was privileged then to do a life skill program, somewhat like mine, but the one we did was really for persons who were going through drugs. But then I did a specific program that dealt with domestic violence, and I was able to head that up with 2 other ladies. And at that program, I met Professor Greenfield, and she did a wonderful job with the stories. And then she asked me if I would share my story. And again, like Dennis said, it was not a problem because one of the aspects of the life skills program did teach you how to share that story. It's a very hard thing to share. And so you have wonderful persons. I had Mr. Harden, who really worked with me to tell my story because I was embarrassed. This is not something that you want to talk about. And again, coming from the Caribbean, you know, this is not something you want to share to let your counterparts know that that's what you come here for. You came here for the dream and a good life, and to end up homeless and in a devastating situation is not something you want to talk about. But through the program, I was able to share, and then I was able then to go on to help other ladies who suffered through domestic violence to share, and work with Professor Greenfield to help them to share their stories.
And Dennis, how about you? How did faith play a role in your transformation?
Ever since I can remember, my mother would get me up on a Sunday morning and put my little glad rags on and send me to church. She'd give me a quarter, tell me put 15 cents in the plate and keep 10 cents for you. So I had that foundation as a kid. I strayed from it over time. But then, you know, in my struggles, you know, with this homelessness and addiction, you know, I realized there is a God. There were nights when I was on the train that the only one I could talk to was the God that I believed in. Faith played a very big part in my journey. I realized on the night I got busted for the second time, I said, you know what, God, I can't do this anymore. I cannot do this anymore. You know, I was in my 40s, and you know, the thought of going back upstate and having to go to prison again, I couldn't do it. So it was there that I made the decision. Let me do this time. Let me come home. Let me do what I got to do. And my faith is what carries me today. Through my faith and through my belief, you know, I'm no longer living on the streets. Through my faith and through my belief, all of my children are back in my life. Through my faith and my belief, you know, when I first went to Catholic Charities, the lady who interviewed me, she saw me carrying a little pocket Bible, and she said, you know what? I want you to find a church. She didn't say which church. She didn't push me one way or the other, but I found the church. And today, I belong to a church. I belong to the Middle Collegiate Church of New York City. It's a Dutch Reformed church. It's the oldest church in one of the oldest churches in the country. And Sophia mentioned Mr. Horton, George Horton. I was standing in George Horton's office, and I get a call, and they asked me if I would consider being ordained as a deacon in their church.
And that will have to be where we'll break for right now. You're listening to Westchester Eye on the Radio here on WVOX 1460 AM.
With Peter Moses, John Sharan, and Ardina Seward on 1460 WVOX.
Welcome back to our discussion this week about Sacred Shelter, a book about ending homelessness or attempts to end homelessness in New York City. We're graced with the editor of the book, Susan Greenfield, an English professor from Fordham University, and Dennis Barton and Sophia Worrell, two people who have overcome homelessness. And Professor Greenfield, perhaps you can tell us a little bit. We just heard from Dennis and Sophia about the importance that faith played in their lives. You did a lot of research. You spoke to a lot of people who have a lot of stories to tell, some of which made it into the book. How important has faith been? Is that been something that has been a large number of people have followed or used that to help them deal with this issue?
Most of the people in the book were helped enormously by faith, a belief in God, a belief in a kind of spiritual purpose. One of the things that's really interesting about the book, though, I think, is that when people start talking about moving out of homelessness, that's often when people started to talk more about God and faith. In working on the book, what became clear to me is that there were there's no magic bullet for ending homelessness except for much more affordable housing and a much more compassionate society with much less income inequality and racism. Less racism. But in terms of the things that can help individuals overcome homelessness, the kind of communities that are most helpful and the kind of communities that the Interfaith Assembly and New York Catholic Charities tried to build are communities that offer people in this situation, first, the dignity of being treated as equal people with powers of goodness and enormous capacities to help other people as well as themselves. And it's amazing how few organizations do that. The second thing is connecting people with community. And the third thing is encouraging people to find a bigger meaning in their life, often, although not always, through some kind of relationship with God. And I do not know. I have not met people. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist, but I personally have not met people who have been able to move past these kinds of situations without some kind of sense of a spiritual process and connection and something more important and bigger than themselves. And often that comes through something, not necessarily related to faith at all, but to taking care of other people and helping, being part of service work. So it's a long answer to your question. Faith, if you have it, if you can find it, more power to you, it's helpful. But it's the idea behind it is also really helpful. The idea of being connected to something bigger than yourself.
Now, the book Sacred Shelter is out now. Where can they get it?
The easiest place to get it at the moment is Amazon. And you can also get it from Fordham University Press if you go to the website. It's in a couple of select bookstores, but Barnes & Noble, if you're listening, we would love to have you carry Sacred Shelter. It's the kind of book that, needs to be in bookstores. It's not, it's not.
It's not the sort of thing that people would go out of their way and look for. But if they find it, it's the sort of thing that will pull them in.
Well, the people who've read this book, and there are many, are often riveted. And I'm saying that not to congratulate myself, but to congratulate the people who tell their stories so powerfully.
This isn't just a story about homelessness. This is a story about people who have found hope, people who have gone on with their lives. And as Professor Greenfield, Susan, has said, we're back out there. We're back out there on the streets, in the community, trying to help others up. Somebody reached back and helped us up. We're reaching back to help others up.
Dennis, you bring up an interesting point. Does finding hope, is that the difference between somebody who will succeed and pull themselves out of homelessness or not?
I think sometimes it's just realizing that you do have hope, that you're not just a marginalized person, an invisible person on the street, realizing there is hope. And again, And again, somebody reached back and grabbed my hand to help me through my connections with Catholic Charities and the EOP program. You know, I was able to get the tools that I needed to do the work on myself to achieve the things that I've achieved over the years.
Sophia, you look like you tried to get in there with an answer. So
I'm giving Dennis a chance because I want to talk about faith, and I have so many examples of when I needed to find a direction. When you are lost and you don't know where to go and what to do, you personally don't know how to get out your own mess. Where else can you turn to but your faith and a God? And in many instances, when I was in my domestic violence shelter and I cried, the answer came. When I was in shelter and I was lost and felt alone, and I said, help me, this is where life experience and faith sharing came in. When I wanted to just get out of the shelter from having to go through detectors, those are things I couldn't take, and to live with 23 other women and the things that were happening, and I prayed. I was able to be went on a retreat just to get up for 3 days. I was able to center myself. When I needed to get my life back together, this higher power led me to the life skill program and helped me to get my status, helped me to be able to find work. I couldn't do this in a place that I didn't know. So
let me ask both of you something, and Susan as well. What is the overall message to homelessness, to overcoming homelessness? Susan, let's start with you. What is the message to people who are not caught in this?
From the book, or in general? I mean, the message is we need more affordable housing and a more equitable society. The message in the book is that on an individual level, you need to recognize, if you're a person who's fortunate enough not to be experiencing homelessness, you need to recognize that the people who are experiencing homelessness have stories, have lives, have dignity.
And are real people.
They're not just real
people.
And are good people who can teach you something. I wanted to say one more quick word about helping and being helped. When I was volunteering for the Life Skills Empowerment Program, I was being helped by hearing these stories. Help doesn't work one way. Help is not just people in need and people who are privileged and give. Help is about an exchange between people, and if they recognize each other as equals, and if the person who is quote unquote giving help recognizes the enormous gift that other person is offering them in terms of feeling better about themselves and their place in the world, then we have a chance.
Dennis, what's your message?
My message is, we can.
We only have a couple of
Be quick, in other words.
Okay.
Yes.
The message is that we need a more fair and just society. We need to change the systemic causes of homelessness, and for people who are homeless, realize that there is hope.
Sophie?
We matter. We matter. And we're people. We're not something else other than that. We're all human beings. And we didn't cause this problem on ourselves. We matter.
Well, those are very powerful messages. Ardina, you and I have done dozens of stories on the plight of people in this situation and the lack of services that are available to them and the lack of humanity that society puts them off to the side as though they're invisible. And some of them live in areas in public parks where they are invisible, where they are completely invisible.
Yeah, they kind of get.
I want to thank the three of you for coming on the show today. You give a face to numbers, and faces and stories to numbers are very, very important for people to understand that homelessness is not just a word; it's a lifestyle. Unfortunately, that is not soon going away on the overall. But when individuals succeed, we should be celebrating that as a society too, because it says a lot of good things about you and about your strength and about your faith.
period.
Ardina, we have a show next week.
Next week, I am efforting to get
Efforting.
Boy. I think it's going to be done. Bruno Lozano, who is the mayor of a border town, Del Rio, Texas, and he's also the first openly gay mayor of that border town in Texas, Del Rio, Texas. And there are a million stories. He's a fascinating guy. He's got a lot of stories. Matter of fact, Del Rio was hacked 2 weeks ago. The entire town was offline due to hackers.
And before we go, just remember, get Sacred Shelter at Amazon.com if you want to read the stories that we saw today.
Okay, well, we're going to be going away for the week, and we'll be back next Monday. Pitchers and catchers report. For those of us whose religion is baseball, those are happy words for us.